As the panelists get set, allow me to turn the discussion over to Tara Jeffries. Tara covered infrastructure, technology, and communications, two important elements of infrastructure for Bloomberg Law. Prior to joining Bloomberg, Tara worked at Morning Consult, where many of you may have woken up to her daily reads on financial regulation and tax policy. Tara is a committed Tar Heel, having graduated from UNC Chapel Hill as a journalism major. Please join me in welcoming Tara to lead our discussion.
Thank you, Aaron. And with me, we have Tony Bartolomeo, CEO of Pennoni. We have Cal Dooley, the former congressman and CEO of the American Chemistry Council. Distinguished economist Aaron Klein, as you guys already know, and Nick Donahue, the Deputy Secretary of Transportation of the state of Virginia. Please welcome our distinguished panelists. Well, I can't promise I'll be as exciting as the Hyperloop, or that we're going to spend the entire panel time on space travel, as exciting as that is. But I do want to open with the idea that infrastructure is one of the most exciting policy areas to me, especially covering the tech-oriented side of it. But it's also kind of the most everyday policy area. It's the most mundane details of everyone's day. It's your daily commute to and from work. It's parking. It's throwing trash away. It's all of that and more. And with that, there are obvious challenges. And I want to ask you, Aaron, first, how do we invest in infrastructure when everything is changing? How do you invest in a parking garage when self-driving cars could eliminate the need for it in a decade, let's say?
So it's a really good question about incorporating future technology into current decision making. I would suspect if Nick had been at the Department of Transportation 20 years ago and they were doing a bond on future toll revenue, there would be no variable for what if there were these self-driving cars. But today we're at that moment of uncertainty. To me, it makes you think that you have to be, a little more flexible in terms of the type of infrastructure you provide. Think about repurposing. It's amazing how long infrastructure lasts in different roads. How many people here have walked the High Line in New York? Okay, that's a pretty big number, right? That was for short haul freight rail. That's why that part, and then it sat vacant, right? Today, I think if they put a little charge on that, they could generate a lot of money. So I think you want to be very flexible when you're at these technological tipping points. I do think there's also a role for government action, because when you increase uncertainty, you decrease the private sector's appetite. Pricing and risk is something that's easy to do when there's well-established models. So I think that level of uncertainty can make it a little harder for the private sector and create one of those market inefficiencies that Derek talked about, where it increases the need for government action.
Excellent answer. I want to go next to Nick. And, I hear a lot about smart cities and smart infrastructure and, how you shouldn't make a smart city a dumb smart city, for example. You've got a lot of data and inputs that you're working with, a lot of new technology making that data available and collecting it, but how to put it to the most efficient use is really a challenge. Nick, tell me what Virginia is doing with data analytics and transportation.
Thanks, Tara. That's a really great question, and I think it's something that states are actually struggling with now. So we have a ton of data at the states, and we really actually don't know how to use it. We're really starting to deploy it and try and use to shape how we figure out how to make the right types of investments. So for years, we used travel demand models. And these models, if you're wondering how they were developed, is we sent out survey questions to people whose license plates we wrote down. We hoped that some of them sent it back. And then of the 10% who sent it back, we hoped that Harry actually knew what he was doing on Friday 4 weeks ago at 5 p.m. I don't think Harry actually did. So one of the things that Secretary Khan mentioned is we're actually partnering now with firms where we are taking cell phone data and GPS data to really start to understand where people are traveling and how they're using the systems. So a lot of the travel models, what they would tell you is I-95 is congested between this interchange. But what they didn't tell you is where were the people who are congesting this section of I-95 coming from? Are they all coming from Maryland and driving to Richmond? Or do they get on the most recent interchange, and are they getting off at the interchange right after that? And finally, being able to understand some of that information is really going to allow us as DOTs to make a lot smarter decisions. But it also means we're using more accurate information, because your cell phone is not going to lie or misremember where you might have been, and it will always answer the question, unlike the surveys that were never responded. And so I think states still have a long way to go, but we're starting to make some real progress to leverage this data to make smarter decisions.
Nick, I would just note that that's really interesting to me, because I, the other day, couldn't remember the exact address of somewhere that I had been in, months prior. So, what I did, I looked at my Uber history and found the trip that I had taken there. And I actually figured it out that way. Not sure if that's just how my weird mind works, but it's interesting how we kind of have little maps of people's habits like that. Tony, I want to go to you next and talk about this idea of data-driven decision-making, but from the engineering perspective. How do we design with using data to guide decisions?
Well, that's a good question, and thank you, Tara. The notion of data-driven decision-making needs to be coupled with risk-based prioritization, and I think that the algorithms that are being created now and in place in the engineering community are driving right towards that sort of application and beneficial use of the data. So when you have the data, obviously, the value of it is when you can convert it to actionable knowledge. So a lot of the push at ASCE right now, we've talked about the need for funding. Funding and financing are two different things, and we need to understand that in this arena, because one is going to drive the other if there's enough return on an investment in the private sector coming in. However, we in this grand challenge that was developed, we took out the public policy issues that ASE has not a lot of control over, or the funding and financing, and we focused on this grand challenge to reduce the life cycle cost of our nation's infrastructure. And the big, bold, hairy challenge was by 50% by 2025. Now, that will help optimize the spending or investments that are being made, because if you look at a life cycle cost analysis in your capital or O&M decision making, you will get more for the revenue invested over the lifetime, not over a 2, 4, 6-year election cycle. So 4 pillars that we put in play to drive home this objective is the application of innovative technology, resiliency being built into the decision-making process for your infrastructure, performance-based standards or criteria being considered when you're going out for an infrastructure project, and doing a life cycle cost analysis and really using it in your decision-making process and not just cheapest first cost. We've seen situations where cheapest first cost didn't consider that 80% or more of the life cycle cost is subsequent to the initial capital investment. So by managing that more effectively, we'll optimize the investments, and this is with data analytics, be able to really get more for the resources being invested.
Thanks, Tony. Cal, I want to go to you next. And, I've been looking at smart cities and smart infrastructure, and I keep seeing articles from the 1890s. And I'm confused as to how this is happening, but a lot of the financing mechanisms in particular are very traditional. A lot of the infrastructure that is being built and considered is based on old systems. In the materials aspect of this, are you seeing this kind of what's old is new again trend, or are you starting from scratch in some ways?
I think that one of the real challenges we have is and it gets really to Aaron's opening comments. When you said, you're kind of looking at infrastructure kind of like, how do you invest more wisely? And I think that should unify all of us as, as parties to this. We have a vested interest in seeing more invested, and we have a vested interest also in it being invested more wisely. And you're going to be hearing from Congressman Babin a little bit later about his legislation that he introduced that we're very supportive of, which is the Municipal Infrastructure Savings and Transparency Act. And what this basically does is how do we create a better environment and the policies in place that ensure that decisions that are being made on infrastructure are embodying the 4 pillars that Tony just talked about, that foster a greater opportunity for all materials that meet a certain performance specification that includes a life cycle cost analysis, that they are allowed to be considered for an infrastructure project. All too often, we currently see that there's regulatory and structural impediments because we have some municipalities that have codes in place which are material specific. And if you want to create an environment that ensures that you almost see more investment in innovative new products, you need to have this open marketplace and opportunity. And when you also look at this in the context of taxpayers, one of the struggles, and I served in Congress, is how do you generate more popular support for investing in infrastructure? They need to have the confidence, your taxpayers, your constituents need to have the confidence that it's going to be made, those investments are being made in the most cost-effective way. And that's where this concept that Congressman Babbitt is advancing, which is called open competition, is ensuring that we can go beyond these, there's no material preferences here. It's all on what material is going to perform the best. And the National Taxpayer Union looked at this concept as it's being deployed today, and they determined that there would be $370 billion saved on the $1.3 trillion needed in water infrastructure projects if we just had this policy in place. So we think this is a critical component to ensure that you build more support from taxpayers for the funding, that you create a better environment for more innovation of all materials that are going into infrastructure that will deliver more cost-effective infrastructure throughout the country.
Great, and let's talk for a minute more about financing mechanisms. And I want to start with kind of what I consider the most traditional infrastructure financing mechanism of all, which is the muni bond market. Aaron, how is this? Where are we now in terms of muni bond demand, specifically from corporate investors? And I think this is kind of an overlooked aspect of the whole picture of especially state and local infrastructure financing.
Yeah, so let me pick up on what Tony said, because it's music to the ears of an economist to hear an engineer appreciate the distinction between funding and financing. Because I can tell you, this town is littered with transportation and infrastructure experts who use the terms interchangeably, and they are wrong. Funding is money. Financing is how you get money over time, right? Food is food. When you choose to eat you can change when you choose to eat. That doesn't make food appear. So when we're talking about funding, the federal government has historically funded infrastructure with very little financing. There's been some TIFIA, WIFIA, RIF that the Undersecretary mentioned and the administration seeks to grow, which is a good idea. On the other hand, the federal government's historical role has been funding. States and local governments' historical role has been to finance future streams of funding. And they've been the ones who've done that. They've created a state, municipal, local debt market that is the envy of the world. Trillions of dollars, mostly going to infrastructure, all with a large hidden federal subsidy, which is that they are not subject to federal income tax. I bring this up because the federal tax code has changed, as folks in the room are aware. The corporate tax rate was lowered from 35 to 21%, and the top marginal rates for the wealthiest people, who, by the way, are the ones who buy debt. That's the ones who hold bonds. If we had 1,000 people in the room, do you know how many of those 1,000 would own bonds outside of their retirement or pension account? 12. And those 12 are of the wealthiest 1,000. What's happened is we've lowered the top marginal tax rates. corporate investors, including banks and insurance companies, own a third of municipal debt. The other two-thirds are largely retail investors. Everybody's paying lower taxes now, particularly corporations, 14%. Because their tax rates are lower, the value of being tax-free decreases. In debt, when the value of debt decreases, your demand decreases, or put a different way, what used to be worth, 6% taxable was equal to 4% tax-free. If I paid a third of taxes, now if I only pay 20% of taxes, it's closer to 5% equals 4%, or 4% equals 5. So the state of Virginia will have to, instead of borrowing and financing at 4%, would have to borrow and finance at 5%. A 1% extra cost may not sound like much, but over 30 years, that's real money out of a state and local budget. In this way, the tax code is going to make infrastructure more expensive again.
The math there is something I would have to take a little longer on myself, being not an economist. Reporters are notoriously bad at math, at least in my experience. But thanks for kind of laying that out, Aaron. I think that's kind of, as I said, an overlooked aspect of the entire picture of, revenue, debt, all these other instruments. I want to touch on another one, which is the idea of user fees, or as I heard it earlier, beneficiary fees. Nick, how is Virginia using this type of method for its transportation? And I won't pick on you about 66, even though I did take it HOV to get here today.
Well, I'm glad you're able to benefit from the efficient transportation system we have in Virginia. So I used to work in D.C., and I've worked in the state level now for 12 or, I don't remember how many, more than 12 years. I can't add it up because I'm bad at math too. And what I would say is in D.C., the idea of user fees are really fun to talk about because it's not a tax and it should be so much easier, and it's just something we're doing on the user, and everyone should be fine with it because they're using it. That's not how it works when you're the one imposing the user fee. I would just respectfully say that as someone who has worked to implement user fees in multiple facilities in Virginia. In Virginia, we do use tolling. It's a major part of how we finance our infrastructure. And to be clear, what we're doing is we are taking 30 years, 40, and 50 years worth of toll revenue to build projects up front, and in some cases getting small annuities to invest back in transit to further enhance the capacity of those facilities. But putting in place user fees is a very, very difficult task. We have two projects in Virginia, and I will talk about them. It's I-66. There's two parts of Interstate 66. For those of you who live in Virginia, you're probably familiar with this. There's 10 miles that's inside the Beltway, if you will, or from 495 basically to the stoplight in D.C. That is a 4-lane road where we converted the entire facility in the peak direction in the morning and then outbound in the evening into an express lane where people who previously could not use the road were now given the option to do so for a variable toll that ensured a 50-mile-per-hour trip when they use that facility. It also sped up trips for carpoolers. It cut the travel times for transit buses down by 10 or 15 minutes, allowing additional headways with the same operating budget. It has now been the focus of 2 statewide campaigns since this was announced. There have only been 2 statewide elections since this project was announced. So just to put that in perspective, we're batting 1,000 for it being a political issue during elections. The project right now, the road used to operate anywhere, would take you 15 to 25 minutes to drive those 10 miles, and now takes you 10 to 12. The HOV usage has stayed the same. The parallel routes are moving at the same or faster travel speeds, and the only people paying a toll are those who have made a voluntary choice to do so. But I also spent the last 60 days in the General Assembly fighting, I believe it was 9 or 10 bills that would essentially have micromanaged or prohibited the department's user fee regime on that facility. So I think user fees are an extremely important tool for DOTs and other, infrastructure builders. But I would also say I think the discussion that happens in D.C. kind of distorts the reality that those of us on the ground who have to implement those fees face. So when you guys just remember next time you say, oh, it's just a user fee, it will be really easy. Come to Virginia, and I'd be happy to sit down with you and talk about this longer.
So just to be clear, Nobody is mad about this.
Your words, not mine.
Well, I want to go to.
I'm mad. I'll stipulate the vast majority of economists support this. The vast majority of economists believe in this point about voluntary amount that speeds it up, and if you don't want to pay, maybe you benefit, maybe you don't. There's an alternative, and I would stipulate minority perspective, that says that there's an opportunity cost to what they did as opposed to an alternative project to solve that. When you're talking about paying to ensure this fast travel time, it's not just how wealthy you are to be able to stomach these tolls, which can be really large. I mean, $40, $50. It also has to deal with something called the elasticity of time. How important is it for you to get there? People who are time inelastic, I like to think of a single parent trying to make daycare pickup, are probably willing to pay a lot because the alternative cost of missing that, getting to a job where you can't be 5 minutes late, right? One of the beautiful, typically time inelasticity is associated with lower income and lower sets of alternative tools, right? Higher income folks can afford the toll and they can benefit from it, but they probably also, the world doesn't come crashing down if they're 20 minutes late to work one day. So I think we've not as carefully articulated and thought through the differentiating concepts of this as it relates to income inequality. So anyways, it's an alternative view.
And I would just like to retort, because I know there's some media in the room here, that I think Aaron raises a very fair point if what you were talking about was taking the normal general purpose lanes on, say, I-95 and just slapping a variable toll on them. Because then what you're doing is taking a resource and asset that was available to all at that time period and putting in place a variable fee that could have a disproportionate impact on certain individuals who have less time elasticity, as Aaron mentioned. However, if you look at the approach we've taken in Virginia, that's not what we're doing. We're focused on facilities that are carpool lanes only, where previously that solo driver had no access to that facility. And so when I say it's a new choice, it's not that we took the road you previously could use and said, now we'd like $5, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed your experience. It's, you were on Route 50 before. I understand Route 50 is congested. If you would like to use I-66 now, we are going to give you that opportunity. However, your desire to do so cannot be at the expense of the carpoolers or transit users on that facility. And so I do think there's a difference there. I'd also note that the way we've approached many of these projects in Virginia is we look for them to be truly self-financing. So in terms of opportunity cost, there were no state tax dollars invested in the implementation of that project. So I would say really the opportunity costs were zero besides my time and and the time of others who had to deal with many of the constituents, reporters, and politicians who had questions about our project there. And then it's also creating about $15 million a year in new resources that are being reinvested in transit, carpooling, and other upgrades to our transportation network, allowing us not to have to use some of our other tax resources for that. So in effect, creating a positive opportunity cost overall within our transportation portfolio in this region.
Thank you guys for the lively back and forth there. I think Aaron makes a great point about money not being the only thing at play here and time being at play as well. Tony, give me the engineer's perspective here.
Well, this is interesting because of the funding financing issue. I was fortunate enough to be a participant a couple of years ago in a P3 summit hosted by the Treasury Department and USDOT. And I was moderating one of the sessions with about 25 people in it, and it was almost divided to investors, concessionaires, and attorneys. And on the other side were the government entities, including states and municipalities. And there seemed to be a bit of distrust there because one question from the municipal side or government side was, why should we pay you higher rates than we can get financing our own project? And the complaint on the right side to the other was, y'all bring projects to the table that are not even half-baked, and we have to make decisions promptly. And if you don't know how to set up an assessment and evaluation of a P3 for us to look at whether or not we go with the investment, it's wasting our time. So there was one issue that I put on the table based on the concern of paying higher interest than they can get on their own. I said, well, how do you monetize the benefit of having a project done more expeditiously to your constituents, especially if you're treating, in this case, transportation as a service to your constituents? And with no collaboration with the audience, one of the DOT secretaries said, we had a project, and I went to my colleagues and said, we can do this project on our own, and in 20 years we'll have it built, because that's how long it would take for us to work it into our financing. Or we can go with the P3 and in 6 years have it built. To the person, they voted, let's do the P3. And there's an example of what is it worth to have that infrastructure available to your citizens 14 years earlier than a typical life cycle process of a municipal investment or a state investment. I think that those notions have to be considered when you're looking at the cost benefit of investing or financing projects.
You make a great point, Tony, and I want to go to Cal next to talk more about the P3 issue, public-private partnership. I'm sure all of you knew that abbreviation, but just to make sure, you have the congressional perspective, former member of Congress, and you now have the private sector perspective. What's missing when policymakers talk about P3s?
Well, I think that the encouraging thing is that policymakers are today talking about P3 much more than they were even a decade ago, because I think this is a concept that is now being deployed in a greater degree, and it is resulting in more rapid investment in the construction of infrastructure projects. And so I think it's going to increasingly become a critical tool that will ensure that we are also, again, consistent with the invest more wisely, that you're finding ways to bring in more private sector investment to complement a public sector investment that is going to benefit what is that shared objective on enhanced and expanded infrastructure. Where I keep coming back to, though, is that is an important component, but regardless of how you generate the financing or the funding for a project, is how are we ensuring that we have a regulatory environment that is resulting in the most cost-effective investments that will maximize the return of taxpayer dollars. And that's where we come back to ensuring that you have more open competition, which ensures that new products, new technologies are not impeded by regulatory barriers or even codes and standards that were developed 20, 30 years ago when there was a dominant material there. Be material neutral, don't show any preferences, have the engineers have the complete autonomy and authority to make a determination based on performance.
Tara, I'd like to jump in on P3s kind of quickly. So, I think this is one of the topic du jour now because people are like, oh, a public-private partnership. The private sector is going to come and they're going to invest money in our infrastructure, and they're doing it out of the kindness of their heart because they want to help this state get this facility online sooner because that's why they're here. And I want to be very clear, in Virginia, we are big believers in public-private partnerships. Over the last 4 years under the McAuliffe administration, we closed 3 deals worth, I think, in excess of $5 billion with around $2 billion in private equity. What I would just say to you all, having seen the good, the bad, and the ugly in Virginia, is a public-private partnership is a commitment for 50 years. And it's kind of like marriage without divorce law. Once you enter this contract, you're kind of stuck with each other. And there's no arbitrator you get to go sit with like a judge when you disagree about how you want to separate. You're there, and you're there together. And so I really would encourage states to be thoughtful and deliberative as they consider entering into these 50-year contracts. And one of the ways we've approached this concept in Virginia is we also have the ability to accelerate a project without partnering with the private sector. It's through the municipal debt that Aaron mentioned. And so now when we approach a public-private partnership for a toll facility with user fees, we first look at what do we want, what are the key terms that we're going to put in place, and I'm going to get to policy in a second and why that's so important. And then if we sold municipal debt, how much would it cost us? Because when you as a state sell debt, you don't sell debt when you take risk. So you really go for AAA credit ratings because you don't want to default and then have to reach back into the state's treasury. So you make very conservative revenue estimates. We then offer the private sector the opportunity to take that revenue stream and take a risk. These folks are looking for 13% returns on an annual compound basis. For those returns, they should be willing to take a risk. And that risk is they should, instead of us, we look at a 95% probability that this amount of toll revenue will be collected. If they're looking for a 13% return, they should be looking at some percent lower than that. Is that 80%? Is that 70%? I'm not here to tell them that because I'm not a part of an equity firm. That's a decision they need to make. But if they do that, they can almost always deliver that project for less to the public or for greater benefits moving forward. And so really ask the private sector to beat what you as a state can do it for as you put this out for competition, but also tell them what you're not willing to do. And I say that because we have a public-private partnership in the Hampton Roads region of Virginia. It's a very water-based region. There's lots of rivers. There's Chesapeake Bay. And we entered into a public-private partnership where somewhere in the final throes of the deal, the concessionaire said, we would like to have a provision that if you widen any other bridge or tunnel and we can prove that you've diverted traffic from our tunnels, you'll pay us dollar for those tolls for each and every year for the next 58 years. That provision was buried on page 200 or so of an 800-page contract. The very next year, our General Assembly passed new regional taxes for the Hampton Roads region to widen the other bridges and tunnels down there. And it turned out that many members of the Assembly were unaware of that policy provision. And again, marriage without divorce law, we're in this for the next, I think it's now 52 years, moving forward. And we're currently developing projects with the tax revenue as directed by the Assembly to widen the other bridges and tunnels in that region. And at some point in the next 3 or 4 years when those bridges open, we're going to have a discussion with that concessionaire as to what they think that's worth and whether they're going to seek monetary provisions from the Commonwealth. My answer is you're getting nothing. We haven't done anything to you. You are able to pay back your debt and collect, make your internal returns. But they're going to take a very, very different stance, and then we're going to have to go to court potentially if we end up in that position. So be careful, be thoughtful, be deliberative. There are great benefits, but where there's great benefits, there's great pitfalls as well if you're not looking out for yourself.
Nick, I appreciate you being willing to share the sort of lessons learned there. It's clear that P3 issues are not always, the easiest to resolve. I'm afraid we are going to have to be quick on the question and answers, but before I depart, since I am a little bit time inelastic myself today, I'm going to hand it over to Aaron for questions for the panelists, but I will call on somebody now if anybody has a question. In the blue there, sir?
Yeah, I'm Carl Polzer with the Center on Capital and Social Equity, which promotes financial inclusion. So to get back to Virginia, and Aaron asked my question, but a bit of a follow-up. So you've got traffic moving faster, so there are fewer cars using it. So pooled use was held harmless. So presumably people with more money are buying greater access, but would it make sense to do a study of those who no longer use, or what's accounting for the lesser use, and where they're now going, and whether that falls disproportionately on lower-income people with 2 jobs that may have to go to 2 places of work, and if so, what policies could help them?
No, I think that's a great question, and I do think as states, when you make significant decisions that could impact the commuting habits of your residents and taxpayers, it is your responsibility back to the taxpayers who are your fiduciary to show them the impacts of these projects. And so I would say for all of you who are interested in this room, if you go to 66expresslanes.com, we publish monthly reports telling you the toll rate by 6-minute increments. We give you the performance speed of I-66. We give you the performance speed of all the major parallel routes there. We also give you the carpooling percentages and other things of that nature. I do think I want to disagree with part of the premise of your question that there were people who could legally use this road at the height of rush hour when you're seeing these higher tolls and now can't. At the height of rush hour, 8:30, when you're seeing tolls well in excess of $20 sometimes, the road was HOV only. And so the people who are impacted by the imposition of this toll were those who were not complying with the law. And respectfully, my job is to not help scofflaws continue to do that which they wish to do and benefited from, but were not caught doing. That being said, though, how can we do things to help people benefit from this new, now more faster and reliable facility. And so what we're doing is we're actually partnering with a regional commission in this area. It's called the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, where we are giving them the toll revenue and saying, you guys are the local governments. You actually talk to your employers. You talk to your local residents. We want you to invest this toll revenue. Look at where you should build park and ride lots to actually make it more feasible for people to carpool. We want you to actually give employers money so they can create carpooling incentives to get people to try some of these new choices, because what we've seen is most people, just getting them to change their commuting habit is the hard part. They don't want to try the unknown and step off the cliff. But they'll try it for a month if you give them $40. And what we found is, somewhere around 50 to 60% of those people, once they try it, will stick with it even after that monetary incentive has stopped. And so we're working to do that with employers in the region, and we're also talking with the local transit agencies to understand where we can run new bus service in these areas. But I would also say that there is slightly less traffic on I-66, but what we've seen is the parallel routes had the capacity to absorb increased traffic without reductions in performance, and oddly enough, some of them are moving faster.
So let me collect a couple questions here for a speed round. We got two, and we'll start from the right there, and then we'll move up one, and then the panel answer. Please ask a question quickly.
I'll do a speed question. Mary Saunders from the American National Standards Institute. This is a question about codes and standards. So I can tell you that the code organizations and the standards organizations do a very good job about bringing innovations into the latest editions of codes and standards. One of the issues is the lag in the adoption at the state and the local level of the current version of building codes, plumbing codes, mechanical codes. Can you think of ways to incentivize states and localities to more rapidly adopt the newest version of codes and standards? That would help with innovative materials.
So my question is for Nick. I'm wondering where is Virginia government stands for foreign investment in infrastructure, for example, Chinese investment. Thank you.
We start, Cal, do you want to take the first question on codes and standards? And Tony, you can feel free to chime in on that.
Yes, and that I think is, and Congressman Babbitt can elaborate a little bit on that too, is that's one of the purposes of the legislation that he's introducing that we're very supportive on. And it really is, you have, unfortunately, as we've worked in a lot of different states, that you have states that have procurement and put out requests for proposals for infrastructure projects that are material specific quite often. And oftentimes those are predicated on old codes that they have in place. So how do you create a policy and an incentive for them to have continuous updating of their codes that are based on performance metrics, including the 4 pillars that Tony talked about that came out of the engineers? That's what we're trying to achieve in a material neutral way, by creating a different environment that fosters greater innovation and adoption that will show a greater return to taxpayers' investment over time in infrastructure projects.
I'm good.
We're open to all investment in the Commonwealth. So right now, I think we have investors from France, Australia, Spain, and other parts of the world. We were just, ask always, we're going to go, we require by law a competitive process. You need to prove and demonstrate that you can deliver for us a better benefit than we can provide for ourselves. And if so, we'd be happy to partner with anyone.
So that sounds great. Join me in thanking the panel.